All right, for the next hour and a half, and this is your opportunity to get involved as well, we're going to have a panel on, and even though Joe stole our punchline, we are not going to get there by 2030, thanks Jojo. We are going to have a bit of a deep dive and discussion into what's going on for waste and resource recovery in Australia. Are we going to hit the targets? And if not, why not, and what we need to do, right? So just forget that you saw Joe and focus on us. Now, I've just been told this is not working. No. Is that right? Oh, so this is us. Next slide, please. Next slide. So I've been joined today by people from across the supply chain, or as best we could do in the sense of I don't have a generator, but thought it was really important that we have local government. So Stephen Head from Hornsby Shire Council. We've got two representatives, two very clever representatives from regulators and policy in Australia, in Mark and Acela from Vic in New South Wales, both jurisdictions taking quite different approaches to how we manage waste and resource recovery in Australia. And then we've got two very clever people from industry in Henry Anning and Pete Barr. So I'm just going to kick off with a little bit of where we are, and I appreciate that Joe came before me. I hadn't seen the program before, but I guess I'll give you Gail's spin on where we are. This is Joe's data. Having said that, I love Joe's data. I'm a data nerd, but I will point out again that I find it interesting that this data is different to some of the state data, and one of the questions I was just asking Jojo was why have you got the state data for New South Wales, for example, at 73%, yet New South Wales published their data in December saying they're at 66%. Either way, nowhere near enough, but it does show the challenge of trying to manage the data. As Joe also said, we continue to consume and go up. Last time I checked, our 10% avoidance target was more like 18% avoidance that we're supposed to hit in the next 5 years, so it's a big challenge. Joe rang me very excitedly this year to say, oh, look, we've actually gone up in our recovery rate. So there has been with all the emphasis we've had post 2018-19 with the National Waste Policy Action Plan, we are actually seeing an increase in recovery. We are not, however, seeing a reduction in the amount going to landfill by total, nor a reduction in the amount of waste generated, which is a problem. We do have far better understanding, I think, about the importance of supply chains, and if you take it and you want to make it, you need to have a market to take it back. We still are quite reliant on external export, and classic examples of that are obviously still plastics. We don't have anywhere near enough processing facilities onshore, and that's partly because we have nowhere near enough market demand onshore. So I love Joe's Sankey diagram, and whilst we're regulated to not export because we're supposed to be sorting our shit onshore, we're still not buying our shit onshore. So it's a bit of a challenge for us. So that amount's going down, but we still need a huge amount of intervention in the front of the supply chain to actually grow market demand. So we're at 67% national recovery. We've got 13% to get in 5 years. We're at 18% for avoidance. We're supposed to reduce by 10% in the next 5 years. So these are really big numbers that we need to hit. My last slide, which I'll go really quickly, is just a summary of where we're at. Joe's stuff. Just want to point out, as Joe has in his, just get to 5. One more? Yeah. I just want to point out that the 80% does include energy. I actually struggle a little bit with the landfill gas capture, but we do actually have to include resource recovery, as we should, and as we're starting to see energy recovery come on in the West. Those figures, at least in the West, will change. But, given our aversion today to invest in EFW or create the settings across the states to do so, that is part of the solution, but it's not going to be the only solution. Our biggest challenge is market, in my view, but it's not my panel. So I'm going to let each of the panel tell you a bit about who they are and why they're here, and then we're going to kick off with a bit of an interactive discussion across the panel. We've done some Dorothy Dixes, I will admit to that, and then it's your chance to ask questions, and it's an interactive conversation, please. So I'm going to kick off with Stephen Head from Hornsby. Tell us why he's here, other than I asked you and made you, and your role in local government for hitting these targets.
Thanks, Gail, and let's be clear, you did make me come.
Yeah, I did
today.
make you.
Yeah.
I did. I said, I want a general manager, I want you to come.
Thanks very much for having me here today. It's actually a real pleasure to be able to come and talk about a subject that I've become increasingly passionate about, but have to admit and declare actually know very, very little about. It's actually a couple of people from my organisation that are somewhere in the audience here. They're the real experts at Hornsby Council around waste. And that's where I'm the GM for, as a council at the northern end of Sydney. We're about 160,000 in population. We're a mix of rural, residential, kind of well-developed areas. A beautiful part of Sydney. Can't recommend it highly enough. As mentioned, and I think I've heard a little bit of talk today about some of the regional organisations of councils, and I happen to sort of work very closely with the Northern Sydney region of councils, which is 8 councils which are grouped around the northern part of Sydney, and that's probably where my interest in waste has really kicked off, as we've tried to find better solutions to what's an increasingly pressing and critical issue, we think, which is how we're going to deal with waste and resource recovery and make our way towards some of the targets that have been set for us. And so my interest really, and the reason I suppose why I'm really interested in waste is for a few things. Waste is usually, particularly for metro councils, our single biggest service line. So it takes up around about, for us, somewhere in the order of $40 million in revenue out of about sort of $160 million in revenue. So it's quite large, and it's a real driver of community and customer satisfaction for us. So hence, you really can't be sort of in local government and not be concerned about waste. What interests me is really about providing value for money services for our community, about finding, I suppose, resilience in what we see as service that sort of can be patchy at best. It's really subject to sort of shocks and stresses in a way that a number of our other services aren't. Very interested in sort of how we're going to attain the sorts of targets. Our council is very interested in reduction in emissions and obviously transfer from landfill. And so just, I suppose, working towards those policy outcomes has been a big part of my interest in getting involved in waste. I suppose one of the other things I've really learnt a little bit about over the last period of time is we've, as I said, across Sydney in local government, we've tried to bring all of the various regional organisations of councils together to try and sort of, I suppose, work together with the state government to learn more about what we can do and how we can influence, because we really don't think that any single local government can have a really substantial impact on what we need to deliver. So we've been trying to work very closely with the EPA, but one of the things I've really learnt, I suppose, over the last probably 12 months in particular, is actually that it's not just about what government do, and it's not just about what any one level of government does, but it's about how we work with the market as well. And I think that's been a real learning for me over the last 12 months or so. So, yeah, thanks very much for having me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Can you just, that figure that you've been quoting recently about, you and Meg, about how much value and money you guys are spending as a ROC in the system, what is that again?
Yeah, so in Sydney, also I should say, I'll give you 3 figures. Hornsby, we spend around about the $40 million mark. The northern region of councils, which brings 8 councils together and about 760,000 people, we generate about $120 odd million per annum, sort of through the domestic waste management charge. And across Sydney in 23, 24 in the metropolitan area, so that's bringing about 30 odd councils together, there was something like in the order of $1 billion of domestic waste management charges. So it's not, it's not small bickies by any means. And as I said, it's, for all of us, it's our largest service line.
Huge amount of money that you think we could actually make a difference with. Yes. All right, moving right along. We're going to go to Mark in Victoria, talk a bit about what he's doing, and maybe a little bit also, Mark, about just touch on the Act and the generator obligation Part A and just how you guys have set yourselves up a bit too.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. So my name is Mark Bannister. I'm Acting Director of Policy and Regulation, but my substantive role is in waste. I've probably been around, 8, 9 years, I think. Involved in waste in one way, shape or form, and I think it's good to be a COPS first time, so thanks for having me along. Look, in Victoria, I think since we released the Recycling Victoria policy as a government, the wider government, I'm from EPA, and DECA, the department in Victoria, takes care of the big P policy, I'll say, but there's been a lot of change, and a part of that has been a completely rewritten Environment Protection Act, which went away from the sort of I guess, a more prescriptive model to a duties model. Waste was always a challenge with a general environmental duty because it changes hands as you go along, as it's processed. So that makes it challenging just to apply the general environmental duty by itself. But we've got a series of waste duties, one of which I think we could all be making more use of is the generator obligation. So in Victoria, you have to take all reasonable steps to ensure waste gets to a place that's authorised to receive it. And implied in that is that they can also handle that type of waste. So that extends right back up the chain where it doesn't apply so much to the curbside collection because we know that while it's problematic in many ways, we know that obligation probably goes a bit far extending into households, but it applies to pretty much everything else, anything that's industrial, even skipping collections and so on. So really looking up the chain to see where we can make sure we can make a difference in reducing, illegal dumping, reducing waste going to the wrong place. It's been in since 2021, so it's been a little while. People are getting used to the duties-based model. It's supposed to be more risk-based. There are still some prescriptive elements around waste, but it's certainly seen a big shift in how we regulate. But I think there's a lot more to do still, and I think in the first 10 years, speaking to WorkSafe, when they went to a duties-based model, they've had it for 20 or more years. It's a cultural shift that takes a long time. So we're on that journey, made a good start. There's more to do. But one thing also point out, there's been a lot of talk about the packaging reforms too this morning, and Victoria, we've got a really small team that actually does enforce under the current, so we've actually started sending out fines now, which is positive. And I think we've got it's that supply-demand curve with waste. We can't always even got the demand in the end markets, of course. We've got a never-ending supply of soft plastics and other types of packaging. What can we do to try and even that balance? And I look forward to more work in that in the packaging reforms. But we are starting to try and enforce what we can, the existing reforms, to send that signal that it does matter, and we are watching as well. So it's been, I think, a small, really small, but positive contribution.
You guys actually issued a pin.
Yeah, we did.
Fine. It was
yeah, hopefully there'll be some more on the way.
All right, we'll talk more about your risk-based approach and whether you're achieving it or not in the future. Acela, talk to us about New South Wales.
Well, I think a good place to start is this data set. It's up there. Yeah, excellent. So, and I just love watching Joe present on this data, and I know he does it many times, and he has such joy in presenting this data.
He's so cute.
And whereas I don't get that much joy looking at this data set. Though I know data is very important, and it sort of points to me the complexity of the problem. And so where we are at from us, I think if you take the coal ash out of this, then we are around 66%. And Mike, I think you tell me that we need to catch up 3.5 million tons per annum to get to the 80% on our numbers. And that's sort of roughly what is it if you look across waste streams. So there, what's left over, what we landfill in each one of the waste streams, MSW, CNI, CND, is roughly around, I think, 3.5 million. Am I right, Mike? And then, so literally, you need to catch 1 million ton per annum from each one of those streams to be able to hit the target. Now, the complexity that we face is we're a state. And any expenditure we put into building infrastructure, making the system work, has to be found by either as a consumer, I pay when I buy something, or as a ratepayer when I'm paying the rates for disposal of MSW, or as a taxpayer, right? And that's sort of the complex and gnarly challenge that we have, and the history is that we have been waste levy and its effect has been driving this resource recovery. And if you didn't have the waste levy, that would go back quite significantly from where that sits. But what's left now is the difficult stuff. And it's the stuff that needs to be better designed, needs to be better thought through in how we sort of collect them and sort them, and it's not the easy stuff anymore. And I think what you're seeing and what Tony highlighted this morning, what we bring to this is a desire to sit and listen, look at ideas. I don't think this is something EPA by itself, sitting in a room in Parramatta, is going to solve. We have to sit, listen, understand the nuances of it, understand externalities and how they play, and we need to lean into this in those multiple initiatives that we are talking about, not just in one domain, but thinking through the whole system. That's my opening gambit, Gail.
Okay, but you think this 7% difference is purely coal ash? That's one of the things I'm curious about.
Yeah, that's
a big number.
That's a question for Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, he's got a few things.
Yeah. I see.
We'll talk about that. It's a big number, right? All right. So, Preet, you're in C&I and MSW predominantly in Cleanaway, a little bit of C&D. So, talk to us about Cleanaway.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. So, Cleanaway, I guess for most people would have heard the name, at least in some context, is the largest Australian integrated waste management company. So yes, of course, MSW, C&I, health services or health waste, a little bit of C&D, liquids, hydrocarbons, and of course providing the industrial waste management services to the oil and gas and mining sector as well. So it is quite broad in terms of the client base that we service. My role at Cleanaway is to progress with energy from waste projects that we have. I also look after our major projects team, and they are responsible for delivering some really great projects to help with that sustainability journey, the latest being the Blacktown MRF, as we call it, that is, we're really proud of it. It is the state-of-the-art materials recycling facility that just opened in Blacktown in Sydney, and also organics facilities like ECO, which is previously known as GRL. So the team that undertakes those major projects also works alongside me, and then I've got the pleasure of having corporate affairs in my portfolio, and that really is because energy from waste is probably the least controversial topic, so you've got to keep that in the bag. But yeah, I think in terms of energy from waste or energy recovery, as I think most of the industry players like to call it, we have been progressing in this space as part of our Blueprint 2030 strategy. So this wasn't a knee-jerk reaction to policies. It was a strategy that was formulated nearly 3 years ago. We had a Footprint 25 strategy that really looked at ensuring that we had great infrastructure assets to service the needs of our clients and take us on that journey on sustainability. 3 years ago, we sat down and looked at what does the next 10 years now look like for us from 25 to 2030, the additional 5 years, and what do we need to do? And when we looked at that, it became really clear that if we continued on that journey on relying on landfills, we won't really reach the ambition that we set ourselves as being the most sustainable waste management and recycling company in Australia. So with that in mind is really where energy from waste projects came to life, and we have 3 projects across Australia that we are actively developing, and of course, no surprise, they're all in the eastern seaboard, and that is across Melbourne, Brisbane, and closely watching what happens with the New South Wales options paper, and hopefully have a Sydney project too.
Thanks, Preet. And finally, Henry Anning from ResourceCo. Henry, you guys are in C&I and C&D with a little bit of hard waste and MSW. Tell us about ResourceCo, what you guys are doing.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. So I'm Henry Anning, the CEO of the energy business at ResourceCo. We're a privately owned 30-year-old resource recovery company, head office Adelaide, about 1,000 people around Australia and Southeast Asia. I guess as well as that role, I sit on the board of WAMA and the board of RIQ and the board of Bioenergy Australia.
Can't
so
make
get
a decision, can you, Henry?
So
Yeah, very loyal.
get involved in a few of industry discussions. At ResourceCo, we do 4 things, really. Concrete crushing, so heavy C&D, been in that for 30 years, and that's where we started with our founder with a mobile concrete crusher on the back of a truck 30 years ago. Soil recycling, so we do a lot in the soil space, particularly on the eastern seaboard. We own Tyre Cycle, so the largest tyre recycler in the country, and then also energy, which is what I head up, where we have alternative fuel plants producing fuel for cement kilns from dry C&I and dry C&D waste and some dry bulky waste. In Adelaide, a JV with Veolia, we've had for about 17 years. In Sydney for about 7 years. We've just opened one in Brisbane last year, and we also have a plant in country in Malaysia as well, managing local fuel.
I think that's an important point, right? Because I think, and Joe, you didn't help here, when we talk about energy for waste, it's not just thermal, it's not just incineration, it's also fuel, and it comes in many forms. So one of the things that we set ourselves a task as a panel is to build knowledge today. So I really want you guys to ask questions too. So give us a couple of questions and then let's put our hands up and ask some more, because I think there's a lot of, we focus so much on MSW that we actually don't really have a good grasp of necessarily, if you don't live and breathe it like some of us, of what's going on across the broader sector. And, you know, whilst Joe stole the punchline of we're not going to hit 80%, thanks Jojo, I want to ask you guys, why aren't we going to hit 80%? And then, yeah, let's start with why aren't we? Or Acela and Mark, given you for government, do you think we're going to get there?
I think based on the current numbers, our answer is no.
Oh, see, we
And,
can have bureaucrats who speak straight.
Yeah, but that's not to say we should give up on it.
Oh, we're not giving up.
And but I think
We just want you to do more.
well,
Yeah,
I
okay.
think it's to Steve's point before. I think it's actually for all of us to do more.
Yeah.
But also do it wisely. And what I mean by that is that if you think about just think about the batteries, what's happening with that situation, right? So there's this uncontrolled, unregulated material, whichever way you want it to be designed, right? Entering our marketplace, right? We buy this stuff, right? And then when we want to do at the end of its life, the obligation sits purely with governments, councils, taxpayer, ratepayer to recycle that, right? And so if you think about the lived experience of the batteries what we have at the moment, right? What does that mean? Like insurance premiums for your recycling infrastructure is going through the roof. You have to harden the infrastructure, that collection infrastructure, the transport infrastructure. All of that has to be hardened. Government costs around firefighting and other elements, right? Yet now, yes, we could drive all of that through just purely working on the recycling infrastructure, but is that the most efficient way to do that, right? If you can control the design of them, how it's made, imagine an embedded battery that could be easily removed, right? And disposed of in a different way, right? You could make our job of getting to 80% a lot easier, lot less expensive, if you do it in a clever way that takes the whole of the life of that thing that we are trying to deal with into account. And I think that's what I mean by doing it clever.
It also comes back to, I think it was you who said that the easy stuff is done, right? So how are we going to tackle the harder stuff? Mark, from a government perspective, you guys look like you're doing okay. Do you think we're going to get there?
Oh, well, according to Joe's data, we're not. But I think
Don't
we've
blame
got
Joe today. It's your fault.
But I think, look, it just occurs to me that, yes, we have made a lot of ground over the last few years, but we need to keep evaluating too, because what is it that we're going to focus on next and put our energy into if we're going to really meet those targets? I mean, is it a particular material type? Is it reducing the generation of some of this waste, and really where we're going to get the most out of it? Because clearly, as Joe said, we need to speed it up a bit. I mean, we're just going to hit just underneath, and so to speed that up, we really need to evaluate. I think all of us. I mean, there's been lots of great work done over the last few years through government, industry, everyone, and the industry's changed a lot, and I've seen it firsthand. But do we ever stop to really evaluate what has occurred, where we could improve, and perhaps where the next set of low-hanging fruit is we can use to speed it up? And I think that'd be a good exercise to do with 5 years to go. You never know, we might just be able to steepen that curve and just hit the target, or at least get close to it.
I'm going to come back to generator and a few things you said, but I'm going to give Henry a little bit of a free kick here because it's one of his favourite topics. We're saying we're not going to hit it, but South Australia says they're there. How come? As a South Australian company, not a proud South Australian man.
Yeah. If you ask South Australian, they'll tell you they're special.
Yeah.
I think there's probably three key reasons. The first is I think there are some data questions. I think around some of the South Australian data, how they categorise stockpiling, for example, of their data. So, but I'd still say they're ahead of the other states. But I think the 82's got a few question marks on it. The second point, I'd say culturally. South Australia got a container deposit scheme in the mid-70s, like the mid-70s. Much more ingrained in the culture in South Australia. I'm based in Brisbane. I remember when the plastic bag bans came into Woolies and Coles, and it was like the sky was going to fall in. I don't even know when that happened in South Australia, but it was a long time ago. So culturally, it is much more ingrained, and in some ways, those elements are 40 to 50 years ahead, some of the East Coast. I think the third key reason is that South Australia really has one population centre. If you go outside Adelaide, the next biggest town is under 30,000 people. So that does make a big difference in terms of concentration and what you can do compared to the rest of at least the East Coast. South Australia also has, for a population of a bit over 1 million people in Adelaide, a cement kiln at the city. Which means that they have an energy from waste solution, that we do with Veolia for a lot of C&I and C&D residuals for the Adelaide market. And that would be the equivalent of, Melbourne or Sydney having 5 or 6 cement kilns located immediately adjacent to the city to help with the residual elements that can't otherwise be recycled. So, I think there are a couple of key reasons I've seen as to why South Australia's got such a high number. But you can't necessarily look at that and say, that's fine, we can do East Coast without energy. I don't think that's the answer, because the Adelaide number does include energy.
And I think it's important to note that, again, it's residual material that's being used for fuel. But the other thing I think that potentially helps South Australia, which you didn't mention, is it's got the two-agency model. It's always had the market development and the EPA model. So you've got a champion for both consumption, but also product and market, right? And so potentially, and they had Zero Waste SA before they went into, what is now Green Industries. And I think that split enables, because I guess Acela and Mark, I'd ask, like, one of the constant challenges we have is we see everything as waste, right? And you guys see everything as waste. We don't end up having a discussion around avoidance that's not waste, or design. And that's a really hard sort of bipolar walk to try and have when you, Mark, you do have way too many agencies. You have 4 last time I checked. But the regulation and legislation is very much around waste. And that's a challenge, right, if we're trying to change behaviour as well. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think, to me, it's always hard being within a regulator as a policy person and seeing you wanting to drive those resources. You get to see, obviously there's a lot of negative things that go on too. But waste, to us, there's a legal framework, there's a waste definition. Whether one day we can be much more nuanced in that, it'd be good to see. I think there'd be a lot of thinking to do to unpick that. But again, our goal really, and if you look at the things that happen that the regulator would need to attend, is generally on that way through to that end point. So once we've got through the system to a point which it's going to be used, I often talk about use rather than getting away from the waste. We want it to be used. The negative stuff normally happens where it's, it's stockpiled, there's too much of it, there's difficulties in processing it. When it's used and gone through, typically, that's the positive story and a bit we don't talk about as much as regulators. So for us, there's definitely an end point. I think we'll have to get, nationally, it'd be good to decide on what an end point looks like. It might not happen quickly, but I think those discussions are happening all the time, and there's different models we're looking at. I know I talked a lot to New South Wales EPA about their reforms and how we can build some alignment, or at least a common view of what that endpoint is that we're all looking for, at which point a regulator like EPAs can just step back and say, okay, it's now being used. And I think that's around use for me, is making sure it's used.
If I can jump in on that, I think, so whichever form of like government arrangements, say agency arrangement, for me, I'm sort of being spend a reasonable time in public service. I'm a bit agnostic to that, because government has, as in government as a whole, has both of those roles anyway. So it doesn't really matter which agency executes that role, because in one hand, it has a responsibility to protect its citizens from harm, right? And it can't, doesn't matter which agency it sits in, it just has that responsibility. And in the other side, we are also trying to prevent unforeseen intergenerational externalities from unsustainable consumption of material. Really, those are the two objectives that we are tackling with. And it is a complex business. And so some of the things that we have lost, in all our lived experience, we got hit with the emerging contaminants paradigm. PFAS is a case study in that, where we thought we knew risk, and overnight OECD decided they're going to change the way they're going to do risk assessment of PFAS. And then next thing you know, everyone is reacting rapidly to try and put that genie back in the box, right? And so the real power is in foresight, is being not just reacting to those things, but actually having foresight to design things better. And so the work so if you think about our emerging risks that we face, obviously emerging contaminants will continue to be that issue for at least another 50 years, right? And then you got things like these batteries and other things that we're poorly designed, that very much within our control as humanity, but we don't do a good job of. And so I think so if I can wind that back, I think it's one of maturity to be able to actually embrace both of those things, and to really think in the 40-year paradigm and go, how do we navigate this thing with those uncertainties in mind? And don't go with the saying, oh, this is certain, but recognize there are uncertainties that we're dealing with.
It's all well and good, Asala, but we don't have 40 years, we have 5. And it's very hard, for a regulator, I think, that has a very clear act-based remit to focus on things like SDG 12, right? So I appreciate that government as an amorphous mass might have responsibility for all those things. You actually need responsibility and accountability for delivery further down that's not conflicted. So, we're in a hurry, because I think as a sector, we're very worried that we're the only ones who are regulated for things like PFAS. And you can look what's happened in Europe for a very long time with Waste Directive, CLP, REACH. We don't have to start at the beginning every time, but we do spend a lot of time talking about how special we are, not just in South Australia. Henry, you took the mic, and then I'm going to move on to Stephen to ask a question.
Yeah, I was just going to comment from an industry perspective. At least my opinion is, we don't want any more agencies or authorities or things split. It just takes...
I don't know, Victoria's got 4.
Well,
Mark can pick a day.
I think that's a case in point. It just lost time. You get a political announcement for an entity, there's 12 months. at least. And if you look at Victoria, to be honest, what are we, 4 entities? The Recycling Victoria plan was 2020, and that was the announcement, for example, of cap licences in EFW, and boo has happened. And now I think in the budget, the scuttlebutt is they might get rid of 1 or 2 agencies. That's probably another 12 months gone. So I think going to more agencies, less agencies, it's just, we can't lose 12 months. We need the industry and all together, we need clarity and guidance and crack on.
Well, that was one of the things that was in the No Time to Waste report that came out about 3 weeks ago. Like, we just need to get on. The overwhelming feedback in that was, I guess, the time it's taken to date has at least garnered support for getting something done. So, Stephen, MSW from Joe's data looked like when you took gas out, it was about 43% recovery rate in New South Wales. What do we need to do, focusing just for this minute on MSW, to get to 80% by 2030?
Yeah.
Just a small ask.
Just a small ask, yeah. Well, I think I might leave the panel now.
You've got work to do?
I've got a lot of work to do, and the team, we've got to go. We've got to get busy. I just don't think that 80% is going to be a realistic target on the pathway that we're on at the moment. There's just, there's a target, but where is the pathway? Who's got accountability for it? And and I'm not looking to say local government isn't the one responsible here. I think it's all of us. I think that was the seller's point a bit earlier. It's going to take so much work. I mean, in Hornsby, we think we're running at about 48% sort of in our transition away from landfill. We think we'll move to FO. We already sort of do garden organics. We'll get to maybe 55%. We're really optimistic, maybe 60% over time. That's a long way from 80%, and frankly, without probably some really substantial interventions, energy from waste obviously is one that would help, but we've still got enormous amount of material that's going to be still residual in that red bin, and I think that's probably where there's going to need to be some real intervention if we're to have any hope of getting anywhere close to the 80%. But I don't really think it's realistic, and from a community perspective, I don't think yet that generally our community are aware, and I think it was a point that was made by one of the earlier presenters this morning, that the alignment of cost to what it is that we need to do. I know the domestic waste management charge in Hornsby is around about $680. That's for one service. You pay about $1,600 on average for every other service that council provides. Our trajectory shows we'll be at $1,000 within a couple of years. So I think at that point, there'll be a lot of questions that our political leaders will need to be answering back, I think, on that one. So I'm not too sure sort of how we get there is the answer. I just know without an actual plan, without someone having, or a group of us having accountability for it, and what that pathway is actually going to be, I just don't see it happening.
So there's 2 ways it's going to happen. Fix what comes in, fix what goes out. Like, it's that simplistic, right?
Well, that's absolutely. I think the thing that the ratepayer gets is they don't really get a choice, so we don't control. I think I heard, I think it might have been Tony a bit earlier, talked about sort of, end of pipe, versus sort of what goes into the pipe. And I think that's the problem is our residents, our communities they just get what they get, and they don't really have that choice sort of, to pay up front or not. And so therefore, you can be a fantastic contributor to and recycle everything, even minimise. You pay exactly the same as the person who doesn't down the road. So where's the incentive sort of in that?
I just want to comment, if you don't mind. So, there is a cost, and I'll comment on that as well, to delivering these outcomes. I think there's also an economic value to the state as well. Hitting these targets and getting the settings right, is probably a $5 to $10 billion investment opportunity per state, roughly, at least on the East Coast. So in terms of the assets that need to be delivered for these outcomes and the jobs and economic growth that comes from that, we always hear the figure there's 3 times the jobs in recycling that there is in landfill. So there's a big opportunity off the back of this as well. From a cost perspective, even a $200 increase in the waste levy to unlock a lot of the infrastructure works out as about $4 per household per week. One interest rate cut on the average mortgage in Sydney works out as about $35 per household per week. So there is a cost to delivering this, but there's also an economic outcome, and I don't think we should overstate the cost in the context of everything else happening in the economy at the moment.
Is it made harder to understand that cost because we don't actually link it to carbon? So we just don't have conversation also about carbon and methane, or is that just too far off or too remote for people, do you think? Because, you know, we talk about planet warming, people want to know what they can do differently. One of the really clear areas is consumption. Too remote for now? Like, we don't have any national policy that links carbon with material management, not one.
I think Queensland released its waste strategy review a week or two ago.
Yeah.
They have a figure in there about, I think it's $2,500 each household spends on waste food waste that they throw out each year. It's hard, right? Because if that figure doesn't resonate.
I know. And that figure's been floating around from Love Food Fade Waste for 10 years, and it's still not enough to drive behaviour. Stephen, I was going to say, like, we don't do the inputs and the outputs. One of the inputs, again, I'm obsessed with consumption, and just building off Henry's point, if $2,500 of food waste going straight in the bin does not change behaviour, like, we actually need to possibly stop talking about what goes in what bin and rather talk about what goes in what house, because you can, as a consumer, choose what you buy and what you waste, you know, and we just don't spend anywhere near enough attention. You know, it blows my mind, council land, that we're fighting to have a bin and a service and to put material over a weighbridge that we pay for, rather than going, how do we pivot that behaviour to keeping that money in my pocket?
Yeah, I suppose it's you're absolutely right, Gail. The challenge, of course, is how do you do that when you're collecting, you know, 50, maybe 70, maybe 100,000 sort of bins in sort of any given week. So it becomes the challenge of how you do that without even adding further cost to the service that you deliver. But I think you're right about where's the bit that links for people what it is with the money they're paying. Because, I mean, whilst I hear you, Henry, about that $2,500 sort of cost, I don't think families actually recognise that. I really don't. So I don't think we've actually got the message out. I think if you added in the cost of your waste service, the cost of the wasted food, all of the other things, and you just looked at your budget in that sense, you'd see there's an enormous amount of at some point there's got to be a recognition of just how much consumption is really costing us, if you like.
Was the previous Federal Environment Minister didn't want to go there, so let's hope the new one does. All right, so 10 million tonnes of resource recovery required. That means 10 million tonnes of infrastructure, 10 million tonnes of markets. So one of the questions we've got is, should we be mandating recycled content, safe recycled content across the board to help drive this market development? Because we're not going to get there with business as usual. Do we need to start, and how do we start driving market demand in Australia?
I might jump in. That one, we've just recently set a process in train to sort of to start to incorporate that more into our operations. But I've got to say, like anything, change is hard. You know, we work with our engineers, we work with our parks people around sort of what we can be doing in that sense. But I actually do think that getting to a point of mandating it, and I think there's a point, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the waste levy later, but I think there's a way we can start to incentivise councils around what we do and maybe where our resource recovery rates, or maybe what percentage of recycled products we use, and actually give councils the incentive to behave and actually help drive. And I think state government obviously is a huge purchaser of services and goods, so it'd be a great place to start there as well.
Yeah, Victoria Ecologic, awesome thing. We should all be doing it. How many companies here or people here prioritise buying recycled? Put your hand up, be proud. So we're wasties, we live and breathe this, and how many of us are doing it? But we want others to do it. Can that be our takeaway for today? Because if we're not creating market demand and we know about it, who is? All right, on that cheery note, have we done the easy stuff? So one of the questions we've got here is, we haven't unpacked energy recovery or EFW anywhere outside of WA. Why aren't we getting on with that? Mark, talk about the cap. What the?
Well, we don't, at EPA, don't administer their cap in Victoria, so I have to plead the fifth on that one. But look, I mean, we have got facilities approved to go forward. I think there's always there's going to be a struggle getting the contracts and so on to get it up to speed as well. So, yes, I mean, the cap has an impact, the order in which, although I noticed that it had been recently increased.
So for those who
there's
don't
no
know, not only do we have to get financial close, get a DA, get a license, and now you've got to bid in a competitive process to get an allocation to get an energy for waste cap. So maybe I should have asked Preet about that before, but you know, you can put as much as you want into landfill, no cap there, but you've got to go through a competitive process to now prove, so it's like a fifth step in Victoria. Why do we make it so hard for stuff that cannot be recovered?
Look, I think the government's position is really around not wanting to scavenge materials that can otherwise be recycled, right? And that was always the intent of the cap, whether you agree with the way it's administered or not. I mean, that was always just, we don't want to create, I mean, landfill has always been the path of least resistance until we have levies. And I guess those with lower levies would know that that's still the pathway, right? So we just don't want waste to energy just to fill the gap. We still want to be able to recover these materials and not just take over where landfill left off, if you like. So again, that was the reasoning for the cap. Various states do it differently, but yeah, there's a lot too. They're big engineering facilities with complex regulatory planning requirements and contractual requirements. So yeah, that's one step in the chain, a very complex set of events plus community concerns. I think in Victoria we've seen, you know, a very organised community and various groups going around to engagement events and very opposed to this, right? So we've got to be very careful. We've done all the background work to bring everyone on the journey with us, or else it's just going to be very, very difficult for any new facilities to get up.
Do you think, and maybe Preet, I can ask you this question, do you think government has a role, because this is like all technology in our industry that we use, proven, safe, what is the role of government in helping the community to understand that and not seeing it as a problematic technology, right? Is there a role for government with that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think before I answer that, and just jumping on your previous question, I do think with the cap, it links back to what Tony earlier said, and then Acela confirmed, is really listening to the industry. And I think if that engagement was a little bit deeper, you would then really understand how you bring these facilities to life, and then that would alleviate the concern around material potentially being cannibalized and burned in these facilities and not enough material being available for recovery. So I think that is definitely an issue that I think the regulators understand today, because there's a little bit more deeper understanding of you know, how you build these facilities and what sort of feedstock they're going to attract and the contractual models to get there. In terms of government's role, I absolutely think there is a role for government, because I think the reason we haven't seen the facilities come online sooner or earlier in Australia, apart from, yes, they're complex assets, but we as a nation of you know, resources are used to developing complex assets, taking them to financial close, building them. So I don't think that's the challenge. The challenge is that we do bury our head in the sand a little bit until it becomes really critical for us. So yes, until such time that landfill is cheaper, there isn't a lot of, I suppose, need to really bring them on earlier. So what is the role of government? I do think there's an element of supporting the technology. You know, we shouldn't still be discussing the role of energy from waste as a technology and it being safe. When we as proponents try and communicate that message, it doesn't land. We are seen as people who are trying to build something just to, you know, stuff our pockets with money, which is absolutely not the case, especially when you compare energy from waste facilities and the kind of commitment it takes to build them in comparison to landfills. So, you know, when it comes from state and regulators and politicians, it really lands a lot more, you know, I suppose, convincingly with the public. And I think that is a role that can be played a bit more strongly when it comes to energy from waste. And I think New South Wales has done that quite well. It's a challenging topic especially for, I guess, you know, politicians as well. But you look at Victoria, and yes, Marywell's going ahead. Again, I do point the criticality that there was a landfill closing that serviced those councils, so there was critical need, and that was pushed through. Whereas for the rest of the market, you have these loopholes to jump through, and more being created every day. Where it really lands you at the end of the day is in a position where the minister that supports the policy and announces an energy from waste policy becomes the minister that opposes a project when it's in their backyard. That's not helpful. That's why we don't see projects developing faster.
Just to comment on the sort of cost versus landfill, I think the waste hierarchy works when the cost of each option gets more expensive as you go down. And then it should act like a sieve, that everything falls down to the point that it hits the cost that works for that type of material. And where we are at the moment, to the point about are we going to get to 80% or why haven't we built more of projects on the East Coast, is that that's not what happens. That's broken. Landfill is cheaper now than resource recovery in a lot of aspects and energy, and that's why we're not seeing the numbers go up a lot more and the targets be hit. As a couple of examples, the land that we bought to build an alternate fuel plant at Wetherill Park about 6 years ago for $330 a square metre is now about $1,400 to $1,500 a square metre, just for the industrial land. The plant we delivered in Brisbane, the building part of it doubled. The plant and equipment was up about 60%. That's before you get into, labour, fuel, electricity. So, the resource recovery side of things, has those cost impacts have a bigger impact than they do on landfills. Because a lot of the landfills are long-term existing embedded infrastructure. So when you're trying to come into a market and compete with that, not just energy, but all resource recovery assets, it's very challenging. And that's one of the challenges with the current sort of levy, not just in New South Wales, but all over the East Coast, is actually just the straight economic viability of delivering these assets.
You're in trouble if Mike Ritchie's the only one clapping. All right, but I want to come back to levy. Stephen, I know you want to jump into it, but I want to just talk a little bit about C&I, Henry, and I am trying to put questions in as well, because we talk all the time about MSW, right? So you've done a huge investment in C&I down the East Coast. You built this amazing facility. How's it going?
Yeah, I mean, C&I, like when I'm describing to others, maybe from outside of Australia, how we categorise our waste, I sort of say you've got C and D, which is relatively sort of intuitive. You've got MSW, and then you've got everything else. Pretty much, in my mind, falls in the C&I category. I think EPA did some really detailed work last year in terms of C&I audits, New South Wales EPA.
Yeah, well done, Anne Prince. Well done.
Yeah. So again, actually got onto landfills for days and days and days in intercepting C&I loads coming in, breaking down what's really in them, and I think some really valuable work, because quite often C&I is just what's left. C&I sites often like maybe 2 bins, like a cardboard possibly, and then everything else. So we do a lot of work, our sales team going out to visit C&I customers to look at the bins to see if we can take them. And we're like, well, no, you throw your whole, kitchen bag in that same bin. That's pute. We can't take that either under our license or because of fuel quality or other reasons to our site. So I think getting a lot more source separation in C&I is absolutely critical to improving that number. And separating out the pute from dry materials. Again, all sorts of challenges across C&I in terms of, bin space and how many collections and cost and all of those elements, but getting a lot more separation in C&I would allow us and others to do a lot more in that space.
And the reality is we are not hitting 80% by not touching C&I. So we've got our first piece of legislation with New South Wales Organics for separation at source, but we've got a whole yellow bin infrastructure as well as a green bin infrastructure that is currently being missed because we don't have state government looking at C&I. Is that fair, Acela?
Yeah, I think, as I was sort of roughly alluding to, I think we need to get about 1.5 million tonnes in each material stream if you want to get to 80%. So C&I is very important. The challenge with C&I is unlike the MSW, the contract timeframes are very short, and it's very transactional, and it's very, very competitive space. And so the effect of the levy is not quite felt there. And this is to the point you were making, Henry, around the pricing of landfill being quite cheap. And so if you were to try to drive that through the levy, you're probably talking about $400-500 levies, so which is unrealistic. There's no way we can get to that level. So if you can't do it with the levy, then what could you do? And that's sort of the first time we are looking at it through the mandates. And so the FOGO mandates is the first time that we are sort of gone into this space. But there is a sort of, and it's not just easy to just say, hey, here's a mandate. You got to implement it. You got to enforce it. You got to do compliance on it. And so, I think what we are building is the architecture. With that FOGO mandates, what you'll see is a set of architecture that allows us to sort of learn how to do this compliance work well in this space, so that when we roll out mandates, they're not just PERIC, they're real and enforceable. So that's sort of the direction we're sort of leaning.
But does it mean we also actually need to look better at the system, to be fair? Like, why is households required to source, separate and recycle, yet businesses aren't, right? So are we bona fide? And Mark, I guess I would possibly dispute that we're all clear about the vision that we're going for. Like, are we really trying to create a resource-efficient, highly productive economy, or are we just going to tweak with the bits that are front of mind, right? So why do I not have to, as a business, treat the materials as valuable that I consume and require to recover them, right? Because there's an amorphous mass sitting in there, and one of the challenges looking at it through Levy is remote, right? And generally it comes onto our sector to solve, make silk purses out of sow's ear, because there's not that obligation, right? So, if we're going to hit 80%, we're not going to hit it by faffing around with occasional mandates in some areas, right?
So I think we just need to think about, I mean, just to add to that sort of comment is that so New South Wales, I think, is 22 million tonnes per annum is the amount of waste that we generate, and I think 14 million tonnes is recycled. So it is like getting material through a fire hose. Like there is like, if you think about the size of the nature of the industry that produces that much material, tonnage, you're talking mining, and you're probably talking steel manufacturing, something like that. Like that's the later of the material, and it's not a consistent kind of material. It's everything you can think of, right? So the problem is just that I think we can't look at it just from and this is my point that I keep making, which is you just can't look at it from point of view of after fact, like after once we use something that we somehow now have to recycle that. You got to think about what you bring, what material you bring in. And I think this is a space that we as a nation hasn't really played a role in until we got this product ownership legislation too. And I think this is I am quite excited by it. I think see what we will do on the back of it. But we got a bit of work to do.
You're talking about product life cycle?
Product life cycle act. I think it's going to change the frame, but it's got work to do. We got work to do there.
All right, I'm going to go to Levy, and then I'm going to come back to stewardship, and then I'm going to talk about something like REDcycle. But I guess just one last comment on the C&I, right? Like, we do have a lot of confusion out there because we have things like neighbours claiming that people are making certain recovery rates, and are we, right? And so we're having a certification process, and is that the right place to say that these things are happening, right? So the C&I stream needs a phenomenal amount of attention if we want to hit 80%. I think there's no doubt about that. Stephen, Levy, you want to make some comments on Levy? Like, I would say to you, Stephen, that you will only pay Levy if you go across a landfill weighbridge, so you should get on board and support us.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, is it? So of that 40 million that we spend on waste matters, a bit over 20%, I think, is effectively the waste levy. And I suppose, whilst I understand the merits, and I think Henry's done a lot to convince me of why we need a waste levy, and in fact, in his view, why it needs to be more. So I congratulate him, because I'm never easy to convince on how to spend more money on something. But I suppose it just seems like it's a pretty blunt tool that just sits there. It doesn't really link to performance. It feels from a local government perspective like it just helps to prop up a state government budget. And I'm sure the funds go off to things that are really necessary, but why don't we call it that if that's what it actually is for? I'd like to see something. If it must be increased, then that seems to be the direction we'll go in. But what about incentivising local government, state government, the private sector genuinely around investment back in, like we talked about earlier? There's in metropolitan streamline, there's $1 billion a year in Sydney that's being spent on waste. Surely within that we've got the funds there to be able to, to find the solution. I think Henry said 10 billion is what we need in each of the eastern states over the next decade or so. Well, there's $1 billion a year sort of there. Surely there's a good start in there somewhere. So it's really, for me, it's about sort of if you're going to have a levy, align it back so that we actually solve the problem that gives us the rise to actually need to have a levy in place initially. That's kind of I think the position that most local governments would sit with.
Might clap then too, by the way, but you had a few more. So
Well,
it's okay.
you said that's not good.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
but the rest made it even for you. Others want to comment on levy? Like, I think Henry's point, right, is completely right. The cost should get more expensive as you go down. There is a challenge completely around those who are paying the levy are not tend to be those who generate the material, right? So somehow we need to bridge that gap.
So I think just want to take it back, just add one more thing to that equation. I'm not disagreeing about the cost base and everything that lands there. The fundamental problem that we are trying to solve is a market failure, right? And if there was a true externality value of this material, that 14 billion tons, 40 million tons per annum, that there was actually value in it, we wouldn't be in this conversation. So levy is an imperfect instrument that's trying to drive as much as it can towards trying to make it of that 22 million, the 17 million tons recycled. That's what the levy underpins. And what it sort of does, it make it commercially viable. The problem is all of these manufacturing bases, so the stuff that we can't quite deal with right now, is the plastic. It's the weird and wonderful textiles and mixed fabrics, the stuff that's like paper that's really low value, you can't really get stuff out of. And so but the manufacturing basis of that stuff, that stuff came in, is nowhere near us. They're all long ways away in countries that has very, cheaper labor or cheaper construction
fuel,
costs,
cheaper property, cheaper everything.
Everything, right? So that's the fundamental thing, and we must not lose track of that in this conversation. So the energy is a very practical, pragmatic answer there, because we can always generate more energy. I think there's no limit to the limit caused by the end market, but obviously it comes with lots of concerns, lots of community concerns, lots of uncertainty. And when I listen to you, Henry, I think I totally agree with you in the energy paradigm. That is true. But I think I would hate to think that we just go, answer is energy, and we build a few energy from waste plants and we're done. Like we hit 80 and we're done, right? We got to get higher on that order, and so then the next thing is you got to fix the demand. Once we pull this stuff out, we better design it. We get better material. Where do we take it? Who's going to buy that? Who's gonna make it commercial for us to do it, and it doesn't have to be popped up by the taxpayer and the ratepayer to make that happen. And I think that's the bit that we don't get to in these conversations, and that's the bit we must bring forward in the next few years, I think.
Completely. Oh, you want to?
I was just going to say, I think it's definitely, in my view, it's not all levy, and it's also definitely not all energy. By any stretch, and I think it should be absolutely clear where energy sits in the waste hierarchy. I think it should also be clear where landfill sits in the waste hierarchy. But as an industry, I think, and by industry I'm including regulators and EPA, the broader sense of industry is, I think, we need sort of 10 things, all the things we've spoken about. We need clear policy settings, we need clear approval pathways, we need levy that makes the economics work, we need markets. We need to manage the actual generation of the material quality coming in. We need to manage problematic materials. It's all the things we've spoken about, but it's also levy as well. I think getting the levy rate right's one thing. I think there's still loopholes out there as well that need to be dealt with, and ideally are dealt with quickly. There's still plenty of tonnes moving from Sydney to Canberra. There's still plenty of tonnes moving from southeast Queensland to Gunnedah to a non-levy area just to avoid levy. So I think those loopholes need to be dealt with for the broader industry as a matter of priority. And I think to Stephen's point, there's also very much what happens to the levy funds. Is how can they be used, or some of them at least used, in smart ways to deliver infrastructure. Not just deliver the infrastructure in terms of CapEx grants, but also in terms of, what's the best outcome over time as well. Is it, transport solutions to get FOGO compost to markets, for example, that helps underpin organics projects. Like, there's a whole range of ways they could be used, to help promote delivery and achieving the targets.
Yeah, you just made me sad, because I was thinking we all know what needs to be done, so why aren't we doing it? It's kind of where I get to, right? Because it's just we talk about the same things required, but there's an inertia. Is it the Commonwealth? Is it the states? Is it industry? Is it lack of will? Is it complex?
I mean, I would say there's a lot happening. I mean, look at all the work streams New South Wales EPA has underway, and obviously, in a whole range of areas. As I said, Queensland announced their waste strategy review a couple of weeks ago. Feds have been a mess for a while.
A new minister.
Maybe a new minister will make a difference. I guess we'll see in the next period. Personally, COVID reinforced for me that we are a federation. And I think in a lot of ways, every state of Australia is as different as a different country in this space. So I don't put too much hope on the feds, personally, in terms of actually moving a lot of these things forward. I think a lot of it will be at a state level and almost harmonisation or consistency by default, if that makes sense. I think New South Wales product stewardship legislation, I think, is fantastic and hopefully is picked up by the other states. I think it passed the New South Wales Parliament with unanimous support, which I think is massive, sends a massive message as well as support for that sort of regulation. So I think there is a lot happening as well. In terms of delivering the infrastructure here, I think there's getting all the policies right. Then there's a delivery phase, which might be between 2 and 10 years, depending on the infrastructure, before it actually starts diverting the tonnes to get to the 80. And I think it's up to 10 years. And so, we've got to get the policies right, which hopefully is in the next 12 months across a range of areas. And then we've got that delivery phase hopefully kicking off, which means maybe we get to 80% in the mid to late 30s.
So, Sally, you said plastic's a big issue, right? And we've talked about levy, and levy alone is not going to solve what happened with REDcycle. So how do we stop? We've all talked about material going on, design being poor. 490,000 tonnes, I think, of soft plastics packaging is going on the market. We've got around about 30,000 tonnes of end market capacity at present. How do we stop another REDcycle? Because the damage that's done to public confidence in our sector is going to take a long time to undo. I know it should probably a 10-point plan, Henry, but how do we make sure? Because a lot of people now want us to go back to taking it again, even though there's nowhere to go, and Mark, you won't let us stockpile it, fair enough. But what are we going to do with all this material that continues to be put on the market that has no home? Solve it for me, please. Let's go.
Well, as I said before, I think we need to stop some of it getting on the market in the first place, and that's why I'm really interested in where the packaging reform goes. But it's not the only place soft plastics is used, but it's something you come across every day, right? How do we reduce that if we don't have the demand for the end product? If we can't use it, let's try and reduce it, because I guess you talked before about consumption, Gail, but if I was writing briefs to the minister about reducing consumption, that would be a pretty hard one to write, given your economic output is all based on, our whole economy is based on consumption. So if we're going to do that, let's make sure the consumption is something we can manage at the back end and try and be more sophisticated about that. And that's why I really look forward. Hopefully those packaging reforms get picked up with the new government being elected and move along more quickly. We're certainly supporting it.
Yeah. The packaging reform is absolutely critical. I think without it, because it's such a low value product. There is no amount of, think about the amount of energy you'd have to put in to separate all of that stuff out. Think about the design elements and the emerging contaminant risks that we see with it. Poorly designed chemistry, poorly designed polymer. Without it, we are there's really no hope. But I think states also have a role to play here, and it's not just to leave it to the federal government, and I think we can help them. And a lot of the ideas that the New South Wales government has raised in the consultation around plastics is to try and help for federal government to take those steps, and particularly taking on some of the more difficult aspects of the design that we need to take on. But then the good news story there is the CDS, which is the CDS very much, and you've probably been in this longer than I have. CDS very much came about as a litter reduction initiative, right? But one of the real serendipitous outcomes of that is that we get this incredibly clean plastic stream out of it, right? So that's the opportunity to do things with it, and there are nudges that states can do to help the federal government in this space.
Henry, how do you solve it from an economic point of view, though? Like facilities, markets, 490,000 tonnes, low-value material. What do we do? How do we not get REDcycle again?
I mean,
And then, Preet, I'm coming to you because you're trying to solve it.
yeah. Well, I think industry knew the REDcycle scheme was a problem for a long time. And I think was broadly surprised about how long it lasted. So I think there are a lot of people in industry particularly surprised when the warehouses all hit the news, because where could it have been going? Like the processing in the markets just didn't exist. I think, we've seen slides earlier today that show that, the incoming, the processing, the markets, it's sort of any manufacturing stream, it's just that the incoming for a lot of our incoming in our sector is, a scrambled egg, and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, or how to unscramble it. So, the markets for anything in our sector, whether it's, FOGO or alternate fuel or soft plastics is just so fundamental. And it's everything about the markets. It's, it's location, it's price, it's certainty, it's spec, it's regulation, it's all of that in relation to the market. I think it's one of the challenges we've seen as a country with even capital grants handed out by state governments for our sector. I think even going back 10 years, I think, and correct me here, Stella or Tony, but I think like the New South Wales major infrastructure grants for waste a few years ago had about a 30% delivery rate. Because even if you're trying to give capital away, if you don't have the markets, or you can't make the economics work, you can't build the thing.
Well, and often the grants didn't ask what the market was. Oh, sorry, what were we going to do with it?
But and I think we've seen the same in other states. It's not New South Wales.
No.
Queensland, and even under the MRF funding. Was it RMF funding? Sorry,
RMF funding.
funding.
A lot of those have gone back.
Yeah. So in some parts of the sector, you can get free money, and you still can't make either the economics work or the process work.
Preet, you're trying to solve it. How's that working out? And what do you need to actually make it work out, more importantly?
Yeah, look, I think we need all of the things we've talked about. We are trying to solve it. There are others that are trying to solve it, and I think it's part of the solution. So what Gail's talking about is Cleanaway has been looking at, and in partnership with Viva, a soft plastics recycling facility at the Geelong refinery. We are in pre-feasibility stages for that study. By no account will it solve all the problems we are talking about today. It is a particular stream that ends up in the residual plastic stream. Packaging reform is absolutely necessary. I think one of the things we all know, but we probably haven't really emphasized a lot, is the cost of not doing what we need to do. And it was touched upon earlier. And I think as I listen more and more to this debate, and you've touched on that, Gail, in the sense of carbon, but there is obviously a broader cost to not doing something as well. And I think that debate and that discussion needs to happen I guess all of us in this room needs, that discussion should be alive in our organizations, in our councils, in our households, Because really, we talk about achieving great targets and we compete, in line with Europe and UK, but we don't want to pay for it today. And it's not about paying as in, paying the waste sector or the recycling sector. It's really about the cost of what it takes to recover and recycle materials. And unfortunately, it takes me back to the days when we thought we were great at recycling, and it took a ban from China for us to wake up and start to really put that effort back on shore. So while we sit here, I do think there is that piece, Stephen, around, what is the cost of not doing something? Because really, when we talk about even residual waste streams today, and hiding our head in the sand a little bit, and that's all of us collectively as the industry around landfills. I think another part of the equation that we miss is that landfills, for a country like Australia, where our population is concentrated in large metropolitan cities, means for a 500,000 ton landfill over a 40-year life, let's say, 40 years of that landfill, is about 400 hectares of virgin land. That cost of doing something, what is the cost of not doing something? We haven't factored that cost in yet. So there is a lot, I think, for us to digest and educate ourselves and hopefully keep the conversation alive.
That's the Cleanaway people in the room. So, as Acela said earlier, either the consumer pays, the ratepayer pays, or the taxpayer pays. We do not think enough about that, right? We seem to get obsessed with, and I went and made myself very unpopular in Queensland again recently when I was talking about the CDS scheme. It is not a beverage scheme. It is funded by the consumers. The consumers pay for it, right? But we seem to get obsessed with not touching generators, which we must change our mind on. That's the key. We are all paying for this. The concern is if we don't pay for this. One of the things that keeps coming up is planning. It's too slow. It doesn't work with us. Again, that's like government's role in it. But I have a bit of a different question, like planning can take ages. But Stephen, how do we build confidence for councils in selecting facilities or partners to work with so we don't use years and end up with things like, I'm going to get in trouble, buy Electra, right? That if it looks too good, it is too good. How do we build knowledge in the industry so we can understand that what we're trying to do is divert from landfill and make safe products to use again? Like, because we are losing time on often this idea of innovation and technology is going to solve it, when is there really that much out there to solve it? And how do we bring the system together so people can both invest with confidence and select with confidence?
Yeah, that should be pretty easy to unpack.
Yeah. I left you the easy one.
Yeah. So I think there is a whole piece. I mean, if I use energy from waste for an example, obviously there's a really strong community sentiment about that and about the problems with that. But it's with almost any kind of waste facility, it just has this awful connotation. And I think there's a lot of work to be done with our political leaders at local level, at state level, at federal level, to just understand how critical the situation actually is. And I think whilst some of them do, it's a hard ask to get those individuals to really take the lead on it and be prepared to sort of sit in front of communities and tell them what's actually needed. So I actually think it really takes some real leadership, and I actually think the professionals in the waste sector, in local, in state government, in the industry itself, really need to help with that process, because it seems to me that other countries in the world have been able to do it far more successfully. I don't believe that other countries have people that are any better at doing that than what we are. So I actually think it's something that you can't just palm it off to someone else. I think it's actually each and every one of us need to get on board with doing that. Then I think we need governments at all levels which demonstrate some real leadership around, and this has been something that the ROCs in Sydney have been very strong about pushing, is we need a plan that, I'm talking for Metro Sydney here, that spells out what we need, where we need it, in a way that the market can work with, in a way that works for local communities and councils, and then it's really supported by a state planning system that actually, that doesn't just provide a nice customer service, but actually provides some real teeth to actually get stuff done. And I think that's, I think it's all well and good for us to say that we can expand some landfills and do some other things, but if we want systematic change, we need someone who's prepared to lead it. And I think that's a bit about what's the pathway, who's got accountability, and what's the time frame for doing it.
Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment about sort of Gold Coast Council's approach to some of these activities, which has been interesting. And again, I also accept Gold Coast is a special place.
The mayor is particularly special.
So I accept that. And obviously we're talking big councils in South East Queensland, so that does make a difference as well. But, you know, Gold Coast, I think came out loud and proud in terms of needing a residual solution, came out with political leadership about it immediately before a council election.
Yeah.
So it wasn't hiding anything, said we're going to run out of landfill in 10 years. We need a residual solution. We've looked at the options. We can either truck it an hour and a half up to some residual Brisbane or Ipswich solutions for, you know, $100 a tonne, or we can probably pay that much more or less and have an energy solution in the northern end of our city. But I think as an industry, in a way, we're almost in shock that at the time that like a political leader would come out with to say those things and say we want energy from waste, we need it. It's not for everything, but it's for our residuals. This is where we're going to do it. Because as an industry, we've probably been dealing with 10 years of sort of dodging, for want of a better word.
Yeah, and I guess if I'm going to provide a community and a strong sense of a safe community, I need to be able to manage waste, right? I can't keep ducking this, and energy recovery is above landfill. This is one of our challenges, though, so I just maybe ask Stephen this question, because we know that we all need facilities. We're building homes at the rate of knots. We do have more population, but we're not planning for waste facilities. We find ourselves going into, classic example, Northern Beaches in Sydney moves to basically Western Sydney. How do we build capacity for those future growth areas and also to make sure those communities have access as well, right? We're not doing a good job of that. Gold Coast did a great job by thinking about this from a master planning sense. What is the role of council, Steve? Unpack that one.
Yeah, there's a real role for councils in there around this leadership space. But I would say that when we do land use planning in New South Wales, we consider water as essential service. We talk about telcos. We talk about roads. We talk about lots of infrastructure, but we never talk about waste.
We do. This room does all the time.
And somehow what we need to have is that discussion to become part of what happens within planning, so that it's an accepted part that we actually planning for the facilities we need, where they need them, so that logistically we can find the productivity in the system to sort of find an efficient service for our communities. Because at the moment, as you say, Northern Beaches move it to Western Sydney, we move it to to sort of halfway across Sydney, and then sort of ship it off on a train. And look, that takes leadership. Really, it really does. But I just don't see what the options are going forward. Otherwise, we just send ourselves down a pathway that we won't be able to deal with it. And I talked a little bit before about one of my passions is the resilience in the system at the moment. The further we transport it, the greater the risks are of something sort of into a natural disaster or whatever it may be. I don't like answering the question to residents when that bin didn't get picked up yesterday. And whilst that seems really simple, it's a real driver of satisfaction. And I can tell you, mayors and councillors are not happy when bins don't get picked up.
So I'm going to get wrapped up soon, I think, but I'm going to take the answer in so many ways is stewardship and generator obligation, right? Why have we not done it, and what's it going to take, and what are the priority areas that we need to start with? And appreciating we've started with batteries in New South Wales, but we have genuine constitutional issues by going state by state, right? This is not proximity principle, which I don't agree with as a constitutional issue, but that's Gal's law. But we do have real problems with constitutional going by states too. So how do we tackle this?
I think I think there are some lessons to be learned from some amazing work that the certain councils that, and I got the absolute privilege of doing the consultation on the waste levy matters that are sort of New South Wales government's actively considering. I got to meet with about 40-something councils, and one of the things that really stood out for me was the Clarence Valley Council. The long ingrained thinking about what the future needs were that they had articulated just from in everything that they do, every single investment decision, and this is going back 20, 25, maybe even 30 years, of sort of this thinking about the population growth, what's coming, what material you're going to think about, what sort of assets do we need, and then how do we finance those assets? And that is the, I think that was really very refreshing and very like really enlightening, because I was thinking, oh, how do we solve this problem? And I think that's the state, as a state government and the other and the councils and us all together. It's a state that we need to think about this problem in. But I don't want to exclude the Commonwealth here, because I think Commonwealth really has the most efficient levers in terms of controlling what comes in and how things come into the country, and it's much easier for them to do legislation or mandatory schemes or other things that sort of then gets rolled out consistently across Australia with very limited impact on common market and other key things. So, and I think there is hope. I think it's about that vision, and I think it's about us sort of all collectively holding each of us accountable to get us there. I think that's the real the direction I think we need to take.
All right, I think I'm being hurried up here because I'm supposed to finish at 12:20. So I'm going to just ask one quick question of you, like go around the panel, and then, because we could talk for hours, and then quick grab, and then we're going to wrap up for lunch. All right, we know we're not going to get there, right? So what should we focus on practically to make a difference, to help get us there? The biggest takeout, the one greatest thing we can do to make a difference. I'll start with Preet.
I'm going to throw something in we haven't discussed, which is really, and this goes beyond New South Wales, this is across Australia for every jurisdiction. I think the more certainty we can provide on what the evolution of the landfill levy is going to look like, the more certainty you can give for projects to back that hierarchy in terms of bringing facilities online and developing and helping us get to that 80%. So what I'm talking about is obviously, going beyond just a 1 or 2, 3 year horizon, going into a potentially, courageous 7 to 10 year horizon of what levy is going to do. And this is not a new idea. This is kind of exactly what UK did when they tried to establish that sector in the early 2000s. So let's learn from others.
Look, I think from my point of view, and I said evaluation was important. We've got 5 years left. Let's look at where we're at and what's going to make the biggest difference. Targets are great, but they can also have unintended consequences. I think we need to think about where we want to invest in long term, rather than just the 5 year horizon, just thinking where we're best at recovering the material, where we can get the most value from it. And if we've done the work and the evaluation and we still fall short of the target, at least we'll have that infrastructure and system in place to meet those targets down the track. I just don't, you wouldn't want to rush to it and make bad decisions to bring down the targets. We've all seen that happen, right? To meet the targets, and have infrastructure we find is not useful in the future. I think we want to plan long term.
Love you dearly, Mark, but we're hardly rushing.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that goes into project economics and people sitting around a table making a decision about we are or aren't going to do this project. But ultimately, whether the targets are hit or not will depend on probably 50 different decisions happening around board tables or the country on project economics about investment in individual projects. So I'd say that the single biggest thing will be getting the economics right.
Stephen?
Given New South Wales had the decision to go down the FOGO path formally, I actually think that's our certainty, so we should deal with our certainty, and I think we need to make sure that we're creating the capacity to deliver the facilities we need. So in other words, the infrastructure plan, and that we've got the markets that follow that to ensure that the produce is actually usable. I think if that's our short-term focus, I think we should get to that as a first step.
We talked about many things along that chain. Imagine a chain of things coming through the pipeline. I think, as you can see, the New South Wales government is looking at many of those steps and looking at where it can make a difference, and not looking at just one thing. But I won't dodge the question. I will
Back
go
to being a bureaucrat.
I'll say one thing. I think it's the design. And why? Why the design? It's the thing we haven't done, and so there's lots of efficient solutions in that design thing because we haven't touched it. as a country. And then the second thing is, it's incredibly necessary to prevent us from going backwards and coming around FOGO and getting end products that are safe to use. And also, if we talk about batteries, not to burn down our infrastructure so that we going backwards again and costing us more to do that work. So I think I'll pick design.
Thanks, Isella. Can you thank our fabulous panel?